right, good morning, Brush Arbor Secondary students. Thank you those joining us on YouTube. We're going to get right away started. We've already done pledges and prayer here in the building, but today we have a very special speaker. Hopefully you remember from last year talking about creation and all of the, he had the awesome devotional book last year, but please welcome Mr. Bruce Malone.
Thank you and good morning. Does anybody remember last year when I kind of blew things up? Yeah, well, sorry, I'm not going to do that this year. Yeah, you already saw that. I can't do the same thing year after year. We're going to talk about the worldwide flood, but that event, a flood that totally destroyed the surface of the earth, buried every single animal that was alive at that time except those on the ark, ripped up every tree, tore down the mountains and hills that existed before the flood, as sheets of water 1,000 feet deep, filled with boulders and rocks, swept at 60 miles an hour across continents, pulverizing everything. That's the picture of the flood. It's totally denied it ever happened by the entire academic world around us. Because for over 100 years, they've been trained to leave God and leave what the Bible says out of their thinking. So they don't even consider the possibility that this event really happened. Now I'm going to start, instead of talking about the fossils and the rocks, talking about how God built the human brain. He built our mind so that when people tell us things and we observe things and we study things, our brain starts to form like a little framework, a little model of what is the truth, what is reality. And once our brain figures out this is the truth, it doesn't have to rethink it. Everything that comes into our mind, it doesn't have to think, is this true, isn't it true, how do I know it's true? It's already decided, this is the truth. So if it agrees with what we've been trained to think, how we've been trained to act, we just do it automatically. We accept it automatically. If it contradicts what we've been trained to believe is true, it doesn't even get into our brain. We can't even begin to think in that way. Now I'm going to show you a little video about riding a bicycle. How many know how to ride a bicycle? Raise your hand. None of you guys know how to ride a bicycle? If you know how to ride a bicycle, raise your hand. Wow, you really don't know how to ride a bicycle. I'm amazed. There's one person that's never learned how to ride a bicycle. Well, other than you, I think almost everybody in the school knows how to ride a bicycle. This is a guy who's about 35 years old. They gave him a bicycle and he couldn't ride it. A 35-year-old, he just fell down immediately. Watch this little film because there's something different about this bicycle.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike. Meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it. Right? Everything changed, but I have my friend Marty called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. It only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike, ready to demonstrate how to do it. And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Salmon. First attempt riding the bicycle. Yeah, I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downward force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels. Every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I tell you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle you cannot change that, even if you want to. I stayed out here in this driveway, and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike, and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. My son's the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut. Are you going to give up? Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it. But did you see his brain get it? So he, in, how many weeks were we going to do this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do, which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult. It's clear from this experiment that children have a much more plastic brain than adults. That's why the best time to learn a language is when you're a young child. I felt like the only person on the planet who had ever unlearned how to ride a bike, and I couldn't articulate it to anyone because everybody just knew that you can't forget how to ride a bike. So I learned 3 things from this experiment. I learned that welders are often smarter than engineers. I learned that knowledge does not equal understanding. And I learned that truth is truth, no matter what I think about it. So be very careful how you interpret things, because you're looking at the world with a bias, whether you think you are or not. I'm guessing you get smarter every day.
Now, see, the world around us is looking at everything that's happened in the past, everything they see with a bias. They have been trained through public education, through museums, through movies, to leave God out of their thinking, to leave the Bible out of their thinking. Now, many of these people are Christians. They have accepted Jesus as Savior, but they still don't read and trust what the Bible has to say. So therefore, they interpret everything in the wrong way. And even when you put evidence in front of them, they can't see it. It's like trying to ride your bike when you've been trained in a certain way. He knew all he had to do, if he wanted to go right, was to turn the wheel left. He knew what he had to do. Just lean the opposite way and turn the wheel the opposite way. But he couldn't do it. His brain had been trained, you got to do it the other way. And he couldn't do it. 8 months it took him to retrain his brain. And then he couldn't ride a normal bike anymore. Every time he got on a normal bike, he would fall down. Because you can't believe one thing and act in another way. It's why in the book of James it says there's nothing more unstable than a double-minded man. You can't believe a lie and then do the truth. You're going to do one or the other. It's why when we pledge to the flag it says, make my word the lamp unto my feet and the light unto my path. Because we're going to misinterpret things otherwise. Now we're going to look at some ways God has made the truth absolutely apparent. Some of the things we learn, though, once you've been taught to think in a certain way, it's not easy to change it. It's why the world around us is blind to biblical truth. Be very careful how we interpret things. You see, everybody has a bias. Christians have a bias they should trust the Word of God. Buddhists trust another book. Muslims trust the Quran. Atheists, they believe everything came from nothing and that chemicals come alive all over the world and that aliens are popping into existence all over the universe and that there's never been a worldwide flood because they need millions of years to explain the rocks and the rock layers and pretend it all made itself. So everybody has a bias. What matters is which bias is the best bias to be biased by. That sounded really funny, didn't it? In other words, what is the truth? Because the truth exists whether it's acknowledged or not, and that's what we need to be looking for. The Bible and God is not afraid to be questioned. That's what He expects from us. The very first command of God to all of humanity was to take dominion over creation. What's dominion? Dominion, what is that? It's an old ancient word, and it means to study something, to understand it, and to control it. It's a good thing to write down. Dominion means study, understand, and control. What is science? Science is studying the world around us, understanding how it operates, and using that to control it in order to build things and advance our abilities and knowledge. God told us to do science. And just because you're told something if it contradicts everything you've been told before that, you usually don't really understand it. Now, I'm going to jump past this because I'm really short this morning. We're just going to look at 3 examples of how obvious God has made things. The first one is the complexity of life. The simplest cell is like a bacteria. This is a picture of it. If you're in biology, you got to memorize all these crazy names and all these parts. But that's not the beginning of the parts of a living cell. If this were a bacteria, the simplest form of life, it has 1,000 different parts, thousands of them. And none of these parts exist unless they're made inside of a living cell. Now, the most common part in life is a protein molecule. It's like a long chain of beads. The beads are called amino acids, and they have to be lined up in exactly the right order. Why? Because these proteins have to bend and twist and fold to form a very specific shape that has to fit and function exactly right inside of the cell. It's exactly like an automobile. You know, it has a steering wheel, it has tires, it has axles, it's got brakes, it's got pistons, it's got an engine, it's got a carburetor. All those have a shape. They're shaped to perform a function inside of a machine. That's what a protein molecule is. It's just a little physical thing that forms a shape, that forms a part that works inside of a biological machine. Now let me show you what one protein looks like. Okay, that's one of the 1,000 parts that make up a cell. Our bodies have 100,000 different proteins. And they're different because the beads are lined up different. If you change one position of one color, then this whole thing doesn't wrap and bend and turn quite right and it doesn't fit. Just like if you try to make a piston to fit into a slot in a car's engine, if it was just a little bit the wrong size, it wouldn't fit, it wouldn't work. So every bead has to be in the right spot. It could never happen just by randomly arranging 20 different colors, and there's 20 different amino acids. You couldn't just blindfolded reach and grab them at random and they would end up in the right position and this whole thing would turn into the right shape. Let me give you, now you notice out of the back of this cell there's a little hair that's hanging. It's called a flagellum, or in some cases it's called a cilia. It's just a little hair. What's a hair doing hanging outside of the cell? Well, at the base of that hair is a little electric motor. It spins. It's like a propeller that moves that bacteria around by spinning. Well, that motor is made up of 40 different parts. That is one specific arrangement of these beads. You know, the seals and the cups. There's things that produce negative and positive charges. You know, a fan, the motor that runs these fans is exactly like the motor that runs that little cilia. And every part of those motors has been designed by intelligence to fit in a perfect position to make the motor turn. Except here's a motor that's so small, everybody kind of grab a little hair and put it between your finger. You can't even feel how thick it is. I mean, it's hard to even grab one. Got to get a feel of how thin that little hair is. You could line up side by side by side by side 10,000 of these motors in the width of a human hair. That's how small God made them. And there's no possibility. It is a scientific and absolutely absurdity that all those parts could have made themselves and then all the parts could have come together to form a little motor. And we all know that. And yet the world around us, every biology textbook says, all this kind of stuff just made itself. And they know it's not true. They have the knowledge that it couldn't be true. But the only alternative is, here on earth, at one moment in time, there were no bacteria, there were no people, there was no life, and God literally made those things fully formed and fully functional. They just appeared because God made them. That's the only other option. Either it made itself or God made it. And the world around us is trained to ride its bicycle in a way. Evolution's a fact, evolution's a fact. Evolution made everything. And enormous periods of time are reality. So they just believe it's true. And when you see in a presentation like this and the evidence that it couldn't happen, it just bounces off, and they still can't ride their bicycle in that way. That's what's going on all around us. Now, check out this little bacteria. It gets even more phenomenal. They found a bacteria that has not just one motor, but it has 7 purple gears, and attached to each of these gears is a motor. So it has 7 motors. And then there's 21 green gears, so that all of those motors have to spin at exactly the same speed, and all of those little hair propellers have to turn in the same direction at the same speed. Now just think about this. Could that make itself? 21 gears driven by 7 other bigger gears, all perfectly shaped and interlocked, all with motors driving them so these little bacteria could swim around and look for food. You know, our mouths should drop in stunned awe at the things God has made throughout creation. It's why they're there, so we will know God exists. Even when bad things happen to us, even when tragedies occur, even when people die who are innocent and shouldn't die because we live in a fallen creation, because of our actions, not because it's always been that way, we can look at what God made and know that He exists. We don't have to wonder. It's all the evidence is there. Now, why do people believe in evolution then? Because over 200 years ago, they started digging up dead animals. Okay, this is a dead animal. It's called a trilobite. Touch it. Is it soft and squishy like a teddy bear? Dead. Dead and soft? It's not bone, it's solid rock. This animal has turned to solid rock. It's called a trilobite. And we don't just find one of them, we find trillions of them. In every rock layer that's a sedimentary rock layer that is formed at a certain time during the flood, they're filled with dead animals, or dead trees which have been packed down and turned to coal, or dead leaves that have turned to impressions of the leaves. Trillions of these things. Now, when people find fossils, they started to say, well, it must have taken millions of years to have formed those rock layers very, very slowly over time. Except when we look today, we don't see fossils forming. You know, 150 years ago, in the 1800s, there were 100 million buffalo, huge, beautiful animals roaming around on the Great Plains in Kansas, in Iowa, in Nebraska. And hunters came in and they shot almost every single one of them, almost went extinct. Then they skinned them, pulled their skins off to sell, and left the rest of those buffalo there to rot, just laying all over the United States. Not a single buffalo fossil formed. There's not a single bone that turned into a rock. When a tree dies in the forest, does it turn into a rock? No, it turns back into dirt. When a fish dies, does it turn into a fossil? When you go swimming in a lake or if you've ever been skin diving and you look down, do you see the bottom of the ocean just covered with bones in the process of being turned into rocks? No, they get ground up, they get eaten, they're all gone. Even if you were to bury your dog, within 10 years, even the bones are gone. They don't turn into fossils. So there should be a question mark. If we don't see fossils forming today, why are the rocks full of fossils? Because you have to have a recipe to create a fossil. We find dinosaur bones, they're turned to rock. To make a fossil, you got to bury something really fast, because if it isn't very fast, it just gets blown apart by wind and erosion and all sorts of processes. It gets eaten. If you don't bury it really deep, bacteria and fungus and worms and things even eat it, and the bones disappear. You have to have water filled with minerals, because the body of the dead animal, one molecule at a time, has to be replaced by silica and various minerals. And you have to keep away air, because oxygen oxidizes and turns things back to dust over time. That's the recipe. What was happening during Noah's flood, where you got Mr. Dinosaur walking along, dum-de-dum-dum-dum, and whoomph! An enormous wave filled with all sorts of dirt just buries him really deep. And then layer after layer after layer covers them up, and it all happened really fast. And then water permeates down through there just for months and months, maybe for years. The water's just filled with minerals, and the body rots away, and those bones turn to solid rock. They're preserved. Erosion happens, and we find the fossils. Now, what's the world believe? Because they've got to believe in enormous periods of time, or they can't believe everything made itself. They say, well, a fish dies, and it slowly gets covered up with sediment, and then over millions of years, it's completely covered up, and then the bones, they slowly turn into a rock. By the way, we can form a fossil in a matter of years by putting something in a solution, keeping oxygen away, allowing minerals to permeate past it. They've lost hats in mines. They've come back decades later, and they've turned to solid rock. Doesn't take millions of years. But they think it takes millions of years. But what do we see? A fish dies, it floats, other fish eat it apart, and even the bones disappear within a matter of months or years. So what we see happening does not make sense. Noah's flood explains fossils. Here's a fish in the process of eating its lunch when whoomph, massive sediment buried it. Noah's flood. Does it take 1,000 years for you to eat your lunch at school? No. It happens fast. That had to have happened fast. Here's a dinosaur-type creature giving birth to a baby. Ask your mom if it took her 10 years to give birth to you. She lay there on the table for 10 years while you slowly came out and you were covered with dirt if you were laying on the ground. No, it was fast. And there was another baby inside about to be born. See, all this evidence from the rock layers show all these fossils were captured almost instantaneously. One of the most stunning things, and I don't know if I showed this last year or not, but less than, a little over 10 years ago, a researcher found a Tyrannosaurus rex. When she sliced open the bone, she said, I got goosebumps. It was like looking at a modern bone. I couldn't believe it. It's been in the ground for 65 million years, and yet I can still find stuff like this, she said. And she did a scientific report, like soft, stretchy tissue. Here's a bone that's supposedly been in the ground for 65 million years, and you could grab a little piece of tissue and it would just snap right back. There were blood vessels with blood cells still inside. She found not the whole DNA code of a dinosaur, but there were still little fragments left. There were proteins like these molecules still left. Now, none of that could be there if it was in the ground for millions of years because they all disappear too fast. Let alone, they disappear within thousands, not millions of years. So here's a little interview where she's describing what she finds.
The world is still reeling from the discovery of actual Tyrannosaurus rex cells and soft tissue unearthed last week at a Montana excavation site.
Thank you for having me.
So, is that amazing to find this kind of soft tissue in a fossil this old? And what can the soft tissue really tell us?
Well, it's very amazing. It's utterly shocking, actually, because it flies in the face of everything that we understand about how tissues
Well,
and
it's
cells
70 million years old. You don't expect to find soft tissue, do you?
Not at all. No. It was utterly shocking.
So you have to sort of rewrite the book as far as fossilization goes, I assume.
Well, that's the exciting part for me. I've always been very intrigued by how things changed in going from a living being to part of the rock record. And like I said, a lot of our science doesn't allow for this. All of the chemistry and all of the molecular breakdown experiments that we've done.
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there. We're short on time. But listen to what she just said. All of our chemistry, all of our molecular breakdown experiments, we know how fast things disappear, show us that tissue can't be there. But she's been trained to ride her bicycle millions of years, billions of years, millions of years. Evolution's a fact, evolution's a fact. So she can't even see what's right in front of her face. That stuff she found can't be in those bones unless those bones were buried recently. Well, if the dinosaur bones were buried recently, they're not millions of years old. If the bones aren't millions of years old, the rock layers can't be millions of years old. There's all sorts of problems with all these dating methods that indicate ancient ages of the earth. But right in front of our faces is the evidence. Noah's flood is what created those rock layers. But people around us who leave out the Bible and leave God out of their thinking, even if they're smart people, they're blinded because they've been trained to only ride their bike in a way that leaves the Bible and what it says out. And everyone here is in the danger of the same thing once you get out of school. You're going to be trained to think in a way that leaves God out. And God will give you a choice. Are you going to trust Him in what He's told us and then look and interpret what you see based on what He has said? Are you going to believe a lie, ultimately from Satan, that says God and God's Word can't be trusted? And all through your life, you will have that choice in every area. Trust God or trust what the world is saying. And if you take time to think it through, you're going to find out God is trustworthy. Last example that I've got to wrap up. You hear about ape men all the time. Apes have turned into humans, and it's because they look at the skulls and they line up skulls. We do see all sorts of variations of apes, both in the rocks and in the present. We see all sorts of variations of humans. Bigger people, little people, more sloped foreheads, less sloped foreheads. We find that throughout history. People who say, well, a person couldn't have just appeared, he couldn't have just been made. The only option left is that something that wasn't a human turned into a human. So by leaving what God has told us out of our thinking, the entire academic world has decided it is a fact of science that some sort of an apish creature turned into a human. And this is how they reason. I'm going to show you another example. Suppose I'm a scientist and I find 4 skulls. And the first one looks like this. And it's way down deep. So I assume it's really, really old. Probably just means it was buried earlier in Noah's flood, so it ended up deeper. That's the other explanation. Well, I get to name it. I'll call it the Bruceosaurus because my name's Bruce. Okay? Then I keep digging and I find this skull. Now you'll notice it's very similar in shape. Oh good, you swung the camera around. Very similar in shape, but much smaller. Where did it come from? I've got to make up some explanation. I'm a scientist. Well, if I'm leaving God out that, well, maybe God made lots of variations of this kind of creature, I'm going to say, well, maybe the first one had lots of babies. Some of the babies were smaller. Maybe there were lots of trees and rocks where it lived, and by being smaller, it could hide better. Therefore, it could hunt better. Predators couldn't find it as easily, so it had an advantage. By being smaller, it had an advantage. This one became a different kind of creature. Little changes over time. Then, let's suppose, even higher in the rock layers, I find this guy. And you'll notice his jaw is sticking way out, and he's getting a bigger brain. See, this one's kind of a flat, sloped brain. This guy's got a big domed forehead. So he's smarter. And because he's smarter, maybe he used his teeth and jaw to dig and get other little animals and dig under roots and rocks and get worms and stuff to eat. And the longer his jaw got, the better he could dig. And he evolved into a different, more intelligent kind of animal. See, I'm explaining these things based on observation. But then I get super excited because I find the Einstein of this kind of creature. Look how big his brain is. He's got a big domed forehead. And he's probably really smart. I mean, he's little, but he's got a big brain for his little body. And he's got to be smart to survive because he's so small. So I have used evolution to explain how little changes and lots of time have transformed this guy into that guy. And those are the kind of things people will hear and read in textbooks. Sounds like it makes a lot of sense. Let me show you what they are. The first one is a gray wolf. What? It's a wolf skull. The second one is a fox. It's a fox skull. Okay, one didn't slowly transform into the other one. They're just closely related genetically. They're variations of the same thing. The third one is a bulldog. It's not a lot smarter. It doesn't even use its mouth to dig out roots and stuff. And the last one, this one's not Einstein. It's a stupid little chihuahua. He wouldn't last for 2 weeks out there in the forest. He'd be eaten immediately. He wouldn't know how to survive. You see, all of these are the dog kind. God created different kinds of animals, put into their DNA all sorts of variety. I mean, look at the difference between this skull and that skull. It was all in the DNA of the original wolf to have lots of variety. If there's this much variety in dogs, think how much variety there are in people. We didn't come from apes. We're completely different. There's just lots of variety. So I hope that helps you understand how people are deceived, how they can become so blinded by being trained to leave God out that they can't even see the truth when it's right in front of their faces. Thank you.